Hey everybody, Chris Newhan here, and in this video I'm going to be showing how I did the cleaned up mouths, including building the teeth, doing 3D reference for the teeth, and some considerations for making the masks and all that stuff so the teeth are only showing up behind the mouth, and then also using the sculpt tools to create alternate versions of these as both a smile and frown version. Enjoy. So I'm about to do the clean up drawings of the mouth. I have the roughs that I did. I have them parented to the geo that I've been using for the ref the whole time. As I said before, the mouth is going to be a separate grease pencil object from the body. That way the controls on it are simpler. I don't have to deal with so many layers within one object. The slight difference is I did the roughs for the body and all the body parts on the same grease pencil object. In this case, that's not exactly the case because I have that, I had to get that rough to follow the 3D shape. So I have a completely separate object. I have my reference in the background. In between the two videos, I did a bunch of sculpt work on the mouths to get them a little bit more centered and the shapes a little bit closer to what I want. I didn't record that. It's the same process that I've been doing all along with the hair and all those other things to get them to look better from drawing to drawing. So one of the things that I have to do as this thing goes around, I have, let's see how many drawings I have here. I have 14 separate drawings for each emotion. So I have the frown, the neutral, and the smile. I have to get this thing to do those 14 drawings, then move to the next slice of the rotation, do those 14 drawings. So it's a lot of work. So I'm going to be fast forwarding through a lot of it because it's mostly the same process as I've done before. But I will cover the pieces that are important because there is a fair bit to figure out here. Like as the shape goes around, I don't want to draw it to look like a decal. I'm going to have to add in some sense of three-dimensionality. But I'm just going to get into it and I will jump in when necessary. So right off the bat, I made a huge mistake. I started drawing with surface instead of drawing at 3D cursor and on the front plane, making sure that my drawings actually appear on the same plane as the rest of the character build. So thankfully I caught it before I drew too many of the shapes. So as I said, I'm going through, as I've done on all of these, I'm drawing the lines, going to each frame. At one point I realized it was a pain in the ass to draw on that side of the screen, so I changed it up to be the other side of the screen. And I'm doing the same process I have before. I'm getting the lines down as good as I can. You can see I've a ton of undos here as I try and get back in the groove of drawing these thin and thick shape, the thin and thick of the line. And as I said earlier, I did a lot of sculpting in between the videos to tweak these shapes. And there's still some stuff that isn't quite right that I end up having to fix as I'm doing the drawings. But I'm constantly stepping back and forth through the drawings and making sure that it feels consistent from frame to frame rather than completely relying on the reference or using onion skin. It's very important, and I know I say this every single video, but it's very important to constantly be stepping back and forth between the frames and making sure that the volumes, the line weight, all that stuff feels connected from frame to frame. All right. I'm going to speed the drawings up even more because it is very much the exact same process as before. There's no real difference here. I'm jumping back in and sculpting here and there, redrawing my lines as necessary. I actually do discover later that as I'm creating the other versions of these with the smiles and all that, that some of the way I drew them created, as I sculpted them, the gaps in the lines would become more exaggerated. And I may have to redraw some of those, but overall it ends up working pretty good. Another thing, which I think I mentioned in another video, is grease pencil is easy to get a taper from a very small line to a thick line, and rather than the other way around. So you tend to not really get, it doesn't behave the way a brush does. Now you notice I'm adding the dimples. I'm using a different color. It's actually the same color as the nose color, the nose and the ears. The reason for that is I don't want the dimples to stand out a ton. I just want to be the hint of that shape. And now I'm filling in the lips and trying to imagine, because I left gaps in the lines. I'm trying to get the color to fill in that space in a way that looks like that line continues. And then once I do the teeth later, you'll see how I do the fill on the inside of the mouth, because I need that to be on a separate layer for setting up the mask that will control the visibility of the teeth, so they only show up inside the mouth rather than just behind everything. All right, so as I have in the previous ones, I have to do some tweaking, and I will most likely, like I did with the roughs, get these to perfection, quote unquote, and then duplicate those layers to make the smile and all that stuff, rather than going through the trouble of redrawing all of it. There are little things like I noticed this slight little twist. All right, so I got the first pass of the mouth done, and I need to do the teeth. And as I was sitting here thinking about the drawings of the teeth, I realized this would be a great place to do some 3D ref, because drawing teeth in shifting perspective could be pretty challenging, and I'm still not entirely sure what my design of the teeth will be. So I started roughing in the 3D shape here and just sort of getting the general curve and placement. I'm also pushing the teeth back to roughly where they would be inside the flesh of the mouth and getting the rough shape. And I experimented with a couple of things here, including jumping into Photoshop just to draw out some of my thoughts about what the actual design would be. I didn't know the design. I had some ideas of what I wanted. I knew I didn't want to have the teeth be overly defined, even though I do have some characters later in the faction's design, like the whole pile of designs that have very defined individual teeth because they have like crooked teeth. So I had to consider how they might fit in that world as well. And ultimately, you'll see I decided on the teeth not being too individually defined. And through what I'm doing here in Photoshop is just playing around with how simplified I can get it to look, what the gums might look like, and just trying a couple more things. In this example, I end up putting some outlines on it, and I didn't really like the look. And even though I did continue to explore that within Blender with the grease pencil tool, I didn't ultimately go that direction. The other thing I experimented here is whether I wanted to use a black inside of the mouth. And ultimately I go with black, but I'm not entirely sure I want to use that. But that's the fun thing about doing it in grease pencil is I can just change that material later. So now I'm continuing to flesh out what the 3D version of the mouth. And once I got the shape that I was reasonably happy with, I went through and just started pulling pieces of the mesh out and making the individual teeth. And then once I started getting the individual teeth set up, I gave them a little bit of shape. And then you can tell I have the mirror modifier on there so I can get so I don't have to build both sides. When I go about drawing them, I do draw them individually because I don't want that perfect computer symmetry. And then for the back teeth, I didn't go quite as detailed by having the individual teeth. I just had the rough block of shape because there will never really be that much detail for the teeth. And if I did need it for some particular shot, I would just draw it for that shot. Even what I did here ends up being overkill once you see the grease pencil drawings. And at one point I experimented with putting an extrude on there and I realized it just wasn't necessary. So I got rid of all that. I put a mesh smooth on there so I could get a little bit more rounded shapes, and I'm adding some extra edges here so they're not quite as rounded off. And then I hadn't originally intended on this, but I ended up liking the fact that she had a slight gap between her teeth. It just made something interesting, gives this character a little bit of character. Just some visual character. And then once I have the rough idea of the teeth, I step through my shapes and made sure that where they're showing up works for the teeth, or that the teeth are in the right place with all the mouth shapes. Then I duplicated the teeth and shrank them down and flipped them around so the I could have the bottom set of teeth. And it's not critical that they're I'm not looking for dental accuracy. So just shrinking them down and having them be that same piece, just slightly modified, was fine. And then one of the good things in this setup is I only need to draw the teeth for each slice. I don't need to draw them for every single mouth shape. And I made the upper teeth on one layer and the lower teeth on a separate layer. That way it was very easy as I was doing the mouth shapes. I could just move the different pieces, like for when the jaw is wide open, I can just move the lower layer down without having to worry about touching the other layers. And I went through quite a bit here. I drew the teeth in the first pass, and you could see each individual tooth quite a bit more than what I ended up doing. This is where I ended up liking that there was a gap there. Even though I end up redrawing the rest of the teeth so there's less distance between them and they're all sort of merged together into a single shape, I kept the gap between the front two teeth. I ended up also doing some sculpting because you can see some of my drawings get sloppy here. So I ended up doing some sculpting to get those right. You can see I played around with doing the outlines there and turned them off. Ultimately deciding to go with just a solid fill rather than having an outline around the teeth. And here's where I decided I'm just going to draw them with much more overlap so it feels like a continuous shape. And occasionally I'm jumping through and seeing how they look with different mouth shapes just to make sure that it works for all the different shapes. And one thing here is as I set up my camera earlier to create the 3D reference initially, the camera is slightly below the face, so I ended up with this curvature that I had to sculpt out when I was just drawing these from the camera view. So now I'm creating the lower teeth on their separate layer. Again, this is so I can animate it separately. Or not really animate it separately. I'm putting it on its own layer and creating its own keyframes, these drawings for as the mouth opens. I can just move all those vertices down and have them follow what would be the jaw motion. And now I'm going to create the interior of the mouth. I'm going to put that layer at the very bottom. So and I will just draw around the mouth opening and I can then set that as a mask layer for the teeth. So the teeth only show up where that interior mouth drawing is. And I added a bit of that shape on each frame, even if the mouth wasn't open. That way it would still mask the teeth when the mouth was closed. Otherwise the teeth would show up outside the lips. So now that I have the mask done, I need to go in and animate the teeth. You can see some of that curvature that I was talking about. There's a slight upward curve of the lower teeth. And for most of the shapes, it didn't matter. But on a couple of them, I end up going in and doing some sculpting to give them some curvature. And I may end up redrawing them afterwards just to do some final tweaks. Especially as the mouth goes around the corners or as the turn. Yeah, here I'm having a little bit of curvature so it feels like the jaw is opening. And then I did some final tweaks on the F mouth to make sure that the lip feels like it's sitting at the the bottom edge of the upper teeth. And then the final thing that I did was I didn't want the teeth to be bright white. I gave them the same color as the whites of the eyes of the character, so they're not quite as vibrant, and they blend into the overall drawing better. I think that looks okay. It looks like none of her expressions really reveal her gums, so I'm not going to bother with them. So now for this particular slice of the turn, I can then take these and use the sculpting tools and that all that kind of thing to tweak these shapes to make the smile version, the frown version, as I did with the roughs. And I'll use the roughs as a guide since I did quite a bit to figure out to get those to look better. All right, so I'm duplicating my lips, the outline, the fill, and that mouth interior layer for each of the emotions. So I'm starting from the neutral, duplicating it, making in renaming the layer to be about the smile, and I'm locking out the teeth layers and the other layers, and then just using the sculpt tool to get the smile and the frown version. The other thing I'm having to do is for each mouth interior for the smile version and the frown version is I'm adding that to the masks for the teeth, so the different shapes will still mask out the teeth for all the shapes. And as I go through, I'm doing this sculpting. There's a couple of spots I find where like that it's revealing some gaps in the lines. Like you can see that here, where there's a little bit of a lump on the top of on the upper line of the upper lip, and so I may have to redraw that. I'll see how they go as I play around with it more. Yeah, there too. I need to do some redrawing there, and it's possible I can just go in and draw like a little bit of an extra line just to fill in that little lump. Otherwise, I'll have to redraw the line. One of the things that's occurred to me as I was doing this is that I will need a lot of control to hide and unhide different layers at different times. And I also have the different objects or layers that I will do for each slice of the turn. And making the controls that hides or unhides those at different times can get pretty complicated. And unfortunately, Blender, at least in the previous version, I haven't checked in this version, doesn't allow you to script or use drivers to control the visibility of a collection, which would make it very easy because I could put each of these groups of things in collections. So what I ultimately end up doing in a little bit in this tutorial is I insert a blank drawing at the end for each layer. I end up copying that to frame 0. So I can turn off a particular layer by just setting it to 0 using the time offset, which I'll get into later. Don't worry if you don't understand that yet. So those are considerations that I have to do because I have a lot of drawings. I have 14, 21 if you count the emotions per slice of turn. But here I unhid the body fill color. That way I can see how the thing works all together. And then this is actually where I create that blank drawing so I can then drag it over to 0. All right, I'm going to call that the end of this video. I'm going to continue on and do the mouth shapes for all the different slices. I don't want to show it because it's basically the same process. I will be drawing the teeth and all that at different angles, but it is the same process using the reference. And then after that, I will be getting into the eyes, and then we will finally start digging into the rigging, which I think is what most people are looking forward to. And I will see you the next one.